In the damp cold of a Bavarian dungeon, a figure bends over an iron contraption, its joints creaking like bones being broken. Inside it, a lifeless body has lost its human face, transformed into a mask of pain. The room is lit only by flickering torches, which cast distorted shadows on the woman watching in silence. Her eyes do not flicker or blink. They simply follow the last breath as if watching a sacred ritual. This is not a public execution. It is an intimate sentence, sealed by the Queen's own hand. The story of this woman, known in the icy corridors of Munich as a figure of haughty beauty and steely temperament, begins decades earlier, in a cradle lined with silk and expectations. Born into a family of political alliances and palace intrigues, she grew up hearing that love was a bargaining chip and compassion a dangerous luxury. The girl who learned to smile at receptions also learned to hide her tears behind closed doors. In her youth, she was promised to a prince whose affection was as calculated as his ambitions. At his side, she discovered that real power was not sustained by crowns alone, but by fear. Lavish parties masked arguments behind closed doors, and her husband's touch carried the weight of possession. Still, she nurtured a secret dream that one day someone would look at her without thinking of thrones or inheritances. But at court, rumors are more lethal than daggers. Whispers about lovers, betrayals, and secret pacts fueled her distrust and hardened her heart. The woman who once longed for tenderness now saw every approach as a threat. It was in this fertile ground of resentment and paranoia that the idea of a perfect instrument was born. The Iron Lady, a metal embrace for those who dared to touch her with falsehood. With each execution, she felt she regained a fragment of control, as if the blood and silence cleansed the humiliation she had suffered in secret. However, each act also corroded something inside her. Her youthful face gave way to marked features and dark eyes. Her once luminous skin seemed to absorb the shadows of the castle. She was the very image of sovereignty turned to ruin. This is the story of how a queen became the executioner of her own destiny, using fear as her scepter and iron as her crown. If you want to learn more hidden and dark stories from European history, subscribe to the channel and leave your comments. There are secrets that have not been written in books, but still echo in the cold walls of the past. And here we reveal them. When she ascended the throne of Bavaria, she was not only crowned with gold, but also with the invisible burden of a dynasty corroded by intrigue and false loyalties. The walls of the Munich palace were cold not only because of the winter, but because of the calculated silence of courtiers who measured every word. There was always a faint smell of burning wax and a muffled murmur in the corridors, as if the castle itself held secrets in its stone lungs. She walked with impeccable posture, but inside she felt like a caged animal, always about to be hurt. Her youth, already marked by an imposed marriage, became a stage of constant suspicion. Her husband, with his volatile temperament, alternated between gestures of public affection and private humiliations. Every time he touched her shoulder, she didn't know if it was a gesture of possession or a threat. On the quietest nights, she would hear footsteps in the antechamber and imagine whispered conversations, pacts against her. The idea that even the marital bed could be a battlefield began to take root. At banquets, she would sit next to foreign diplomats and see in their eyes the same gleam she had seen in her husband's. Not admiration, but calculation. The sweet scent of the flowers decorating the table mingled with the sickening smell of roasted meat, while her mind wandered to scenarios of betrayal. Each toast seemed like a secret pact, each laugh a conspiracy. It was on one of those nights that she heard the first rumor that one of her closest pages had become involved with a rival lady. The rumor, like a splinter, gave her no peace. There was no proof, but the absence of proof seemed even more incriminating to her. And in the feverish silence of her chambers, she began to imagine methods of extracting confessions that words would not yield. The resentment, fueled by wounded pride, slowly turned into a need for absolute control. At the same time, the mirror revealed subtle signs of change. Fine wrinkles around her eyes, lips that rarely smiled, deep dark circles that even powder could not hide. It was as if every doubt and every suspicion left an invisible but real scar. The first suspicious lover did not die for the Iron Lady. Not yet. He was exiled under the pretext of misconduct, but his absence brought no relief. On the contrary, It only increased her conviction that the only true love was the power she herself controlled. The days passed slowly, as if the entire castle breathed with her, waiting for her next move. Over time, Bavaria met a queen with a sharp gaze, whose smile was as rare as summer in the north. Her presence made people uncomfortable, and the servants avoided crossing her path in the corridors. The tension between appearance and truth grew. On the outside, the sovereign. On the inside, a woman consumed by the corrosion of her own suspicions. And it was in this land of fear and desire for domination that the idea of the machine took shape. Not as an instrument of war, but as an extension of her own body. The Iron Lady, a metallic and deadly embrace, where flesh and iron would become one testimony to her supremacy. The idea was not born in a single day, but was woven slowly, like a patient web. It was inspired by ancient accounts of instruments of torture used by inquisitors and warlords. She sent for a blacksmith from France whose silence was more precious than his talent. On nights when the moon hid behind the clouds, he would descend into the castle's underground chambers, carrying a lantern and the smell of burnt oil that permeated the air. The blacksmith shaped the metal under his steady gaze, and each blow of the hammer seemed to mark not only the iron, but also the fate of anyone who dared to betray her. The damp walls reflected the metallic echo, and the repetitive sound resembled the beating of a hardened heart. The smell of hot iron mixed with the mold of the ancient stones, creating an almost sacred atmosphere. When the machine was ready, it was a hollow statue of a woman with a serene expression, but inside, it hid rows of steel spikes, sharp as the teeth of a predator. The icy touch of the surface seemed to absorb the heat from the skin, and the hinges creaked as if the structure itself resisted being opened. She looked at it as one contemplates a masterpiece, not of art, but of vengeance. The first to try the contraption was a young courtier accused of sending letters to a rival lady. He was summoned to the royal chambers with the promise of a private conversation. What followed was not seen by many, but muffled screams pierced the stone and reached the ears of those who knew how to listen. When the body was removed, there was no beauty or freshness of youth left in it, only marks and final silence. The news spread through the castle like a disease. No one dared mention the machine directly, but everyone knew that something new reigned underground. Some called it divine justice, others, madness. The queen, however, did not care about names. She felt empowered, as if she had discovered the exact formula to prevent betrayal before it blossomed. With each victim, her power grew. The courtier's eyes no longer challenged her. Conversations ceased when she entered the room. However, the feeling of security was always fleeting. The poison of doubt continued to seep in, and even those who looked at her with reverence seemed, in her mind, to hide dark intentions. The machine was not only a punishment, but a distorted mirror of herself. When she looked at the Iron Lady, she saw not the instrument, but the woman who believed that love was synonymous with absolute power. The cold iron reflected her own hardened soul, and with each act, the chasm between the queen and the woman she once was grew deeper. Thus, the palace was transformed into a labyrinth of fear. The distant sound of chains and the metallic smell in the air were constant reminders that any slip could lead someone to the Iron Lady's final embrace. The throne was no longer just a symbol of sovereignty. It was an altar built on flesh and silence. Over the years, the Iron Lady ceased to be just a hidden instrument in the underground and became a ghost that haunted every banquet, every council meeting, every dance at court. Even when she was not present, her image hovered over conversations, shaping gestures and silences. The air in the halls seemed heavier, as if fear had density. Even the windows seemed to let in less light. But absolute power has a price that even thrones cannot pay. The queen began to feel the physical weight of her choices. Joint pain, feverish crises that left her as pale as the stone walls. The nights were filled with disturbing dreams in which she was inside the machine, feeling the cold iron piercing her flesh. When she woke up, the pain remained, as if her body wanted to remind her of something her mind insisted on denying. The court, which had once feared her, began to cultivate a silent and more dangerous fear, that madness had become the true ruler of Bavaria. Advisors whispered about secret alliances to depose her, and anonymous letters began to arrive at the royal chambers. The scent of sealed paper did not mask the stench of conspiracy that came with it. It was then that the event that would change everything occurred. One of her closest lovers, whom she believed to be loyal, was accused of plotting with her enemies. The young man, with a calm gaze and soft voice, was dragged into the dungeons. But this time, something was different. He did not beg, he did not cry. He just looked at her with a mixture of pity and resignation. That look, more than any confession, was an invisible blade that cut deep. As the iron doors closed on him, there was a sharp crack, not just from the hinges, but from something breaking inside her. For the first time, the execution brought her no relief, only a silence that weighed heavier than any scream. When the body was removed, she noticed that the blood, as it flowed, formed an irregular pattern on the floor, like a map leading nowhere. A few days later, her own brother, moved by pressure from the nobles and the threat of civil war, confronted her. He did not do so with swords, but with sharp words, reminding her that the crown was not private property, but a pact with the people. She, however, could only hear the echoes of past executions, each now sounding like a judgment against herself. The fever worsened. Open wounds appeared on her skin, exuding an acidic odor, a mixture of pus and sweat. Her body, once a symbol of majesty, became a battlefield where internal corruption manifested itself visibly. The servants, once obedient, avoided approaching her, as if her touch could contaminate them. At that point, the queen could no longer distinguish enemies from allies, nor love from threat. Everything was noise, everything was shadow. And the cruelest thing was to realize that the Iron Lady, created to ward off betrayal, now seemed to attract to herself the fate she had always feared: absolute loneliness. Winter came early that year, bringing a biting dampness that seeped into the bones. The Munich castle looked like a colossal tomb, where each room held echoes of dead laughter and broken promises. The queen no longer attended banquets. She spent her days cloistered, surrounded by heavy curtains and the bittersweet smell of ointments intended to slow the decomposition of her body. With each breath, a faint wheezing announced the advance of the disease. Down below, in the underground chambers, the Iron Lady remained like a motionless sentinel, covered by a veil of dust and rust. No victims had been brought there for months, but the legend lived on. The servants avoided even cleaning the place, claiming that the air there was poisoned. It was as if the iron itself had absorbed the essence of the screams it had witnessed, turning it into a cursed relic. Isolated, the queen began to write letters that she never sent. They were confessions, justifications, and pleas addressed to people who were already dead or who had abandoned her. The pages were stained with small yellowish drops of pus that escaped from the ulcers on her hands, making it impossible to separate the ink from the physical pain. When read by her servants, these letters revealed a mind that oscillated between sharp lucidity and feverish delirium. The royal council, pressured by the threat of popular revolt and the risk of foreign intervention, took a drastic decision. They did not dismiss her immediately. They feared that this would turn her into a martyr for some sectors of the court. Instead, they cut off her access to information, removed her allies, and gradually confined her to a forgotten wing of the palace. Power was wrested from her not with a coup, but with a slow erosion, like water wearing away stone. In her final days, she claimed to hear footsteps at night, but no one entered her chambers. She claimed that the Iron Lady had moved on her own, that the hinges had creaked in the darkness. The servants who attended her began to fear not only her madness, but the possibility that something truly supernatural inhabited that castle. The fear had changed form. It no longer came from her, but from what she had created. Her death came without ceremony, on a cold dawn. They found her sitting in her armchair, dressed in a heavy cloak with her crown askew on her head. Her body gave off a pungent odor, a mixture of rotting flesh and rose oil. Her eyes were open, staring at some distant point, as if still watching an invisible enemy. Beside her lay a small miniature model of the Iron Lady, as if it were a talisman or a final silent confession. After the funeral, held with the requisite pomp, the new government ordered the machine to be dismantled and melted down. But as the iron was being broken up, one of the workers swore he heard a muffled sigh echoing through the walls. Some said it was just the sound of pressure being released, Others claimed it was the queen's soul, finally set free, or condemned to wander forever. Thus ended the life of a woman who believed she could shape love with fear and seal loyalty with blood. Her story, more than a record of cruelty, is a silent warning. Power that feeds on terror will sooner or later turn against those who wield it. And iron, cold and relentless, does not distinguish between the traitor and those who fear betrayal. On the penultimate night of her life, isolated in her dark wing, the queen asked for a mirror to be brought to her. The servants hesitated, not out of fear of her order, but out of fear that she herself would not be able to bear the sight. When the object was finally placed before her, she did not see the haughty sovereign who had ruled over halls and destinies. She saw skin marked by open sores, a face hollowed out by fever and years of paranoid vigilance, and eyes that no longer reflected light. Silence was her only comment. It was at that moment, alone before her own ruin, that her conscience finally made itself heard. She understood that it was not the throne that had given her power, but the fear she had planted, and that this same fear now isolated her from the world. Images of the executions passed before her like a funeral procession. Loved and hated faces mingled, all with the same final expression, that of abandonment. The memory of her young lover who did not beg for his life came back like a knife. His resigned gaze now seemed to contain a plea not for physical salvation, but for her, the queen, to be saved from herself. But that salvation never came. The cruel and inevitable truth was that there was no more time to undo the path she had taken. That dawn, the physical pain intensified. The acrid smell of pus escaping from the wounds mingled with the sickening aroma of ointments. Her breathing, increasingly short, produced a sound similar to the hissing of red-hot metal being cooled. The body was no longer a temple, but a cell, and the key had long since been lost. The servants who dared to enter found sheets stained with yellowish fluids and darkened blood. The open flesh on her legs showed a grotesque mosaic of inflammation and necrosis. It was as if the moral corruption that had guided her for so many years had finally claimed a body for itself. In the distance, she could hear the wind beating against the windows and the creaking of old doors. She said they were footsteps, footsteps of the Iron Lady, coming to get her. Sometimes she would murmur to the machine as if it were a confidant, begging for forgiveness and promising never to use it again. But logic itself crumbled. How could she ask for mercy from something that never had a soul? The next morning, a last flash of lucidity crossed her mind. She asked for the windows to be opened, letting the Bavarian cold in. She looked at the frozen horizon and understood that this vast, indifferent world would go on without her. For the first time in many years, she felt no anger, only an immense emptiness, a silent echo where once there had been fury. When her body was found, she was sitting up, leaning slightly to one side, as if falling asleep in the middle of a vigil. The crooked crown, the heavy cloak, and the small model of the Iron Lady on her lap composed an almost theatrical scene, laden with symbolism. The odor that filled the room was so thick that the servants covered their faces to keep from vomiting. The funeral, though full of pomp, was quick. The authorities wanted to close the chapter before more rumors spread. But the castle corridors still seemed to whisper stories about the queen, as if each stone held the memory of the screams she had provoked. The true Iron Lady was dismantled, piece by piece, and melted down to forge bells for a nearby chapel. They said that their sound had a strange, overly metallic tone, and that when they rang, some swore they could hear a distant moan. Few dared to remain in the church at night. For the people, the queen's death was a relief. For history, an enigma. The official record portrays her as a determined and strong-willed ruler. But in oral accounts, she is remembered as the woman who confused love with domination and protection with punishment. Between one version and another, the truth remains trapped, as if inside an iron sarcophagus. Psychologically, her fate was the perfect portrait of how absolute power, when guided by insecurity and a wounded ego, corrodes not only the governed but the ruler himself. Her body was only the final stage of a tragedy that had begun long before, in her childhood, when she learned that affection was currency and trust was weakness. Her legacy is not in the decrees she signed or the wars she prevented, but in the invisible scars she left on the imagination of her people. Decades later, the castle was still avoided by travelers at night, and children were warned with stories about the Queen's embrace, not with human arms, but with blades and darkness. Thus ends the life of a sovereign who believed she could shape loyalty with iron and impose love with pain. Her end, fraught with loneliness and degradation, echoes as a timeless warning. Those who build their throne on fear will inevitably end up being ruled by it. If this story made you reflect on the weight of human choices and the shadows that power can create, subscribe to the channel to discover other hidden narratives from history. Comment on what struck you most about this journey, and share it so that more people can discover that not all horror is born on the battlefield. Sometimes, it is forged in the cold silence of a castle.